And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this week we're reading Stafford Beer. We're reading his book, Designing Freedom, which is it a book or is it a set of lectures? Or both?
Yeah, I mean, it was a set of lectures, part of the Massey Lecture series that the CBC has done, the Canadian Broadcasting Company has done since 1961. This was the 1973 Massey Lecture, and it has been adapted into a book with like some additional notes at the end of each lecture to help the reader understand what beer is going on about. But fundamentally, it's written to be spoken, right?
Yeah. Why are we reading this? We're reading it because it's the shortest of all of Stafford Beer's books, and most of his books are... I don't think we're ever going to get around to Brain of the Firm on this show. It is simply too much to tackle. However, most of the ideas, the fundamental ideas at least, show up here. I think it's a pretty good intro to Stafford's thought, right? Like, and the problems he was trying to tackle, and the basics of the techniques.
Yeah, I think outside of the Pickering chapter on beer, it's like it's an intro to beer written by beer, right? That has that advantage to it. If you want the overview of beer's thought and career, I think reading the Cybernetic Brain is the place to go. But if you want to sort of get a sense of beer in his own words, this is a really good place to start.
Yeah, certainly. And that's why we're reading it. I think it'll be tough to ever get around to reading one of the longer ones. So there are 6 lectures. They're pretty short, and they've got these nice little pictures at the end. I think it's a sort of an odd mix of being pretty easy to read, especially because it's given in a lecture format. It's he's trying to get stuff across, right? Like he's trying to do this pedagogical sort of thing of teaching you what he's going on about. It suffers a little bit for the length. Some of the concepts are actually kind of hard to grasp if you've not really been following them so far. But you can't win them all, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's important not only that these are lectures, but that as far as I remember, the broadcast schedule that they do of the Massey Lectures, there's always 6 of them in this case, is that they're spaced out by a week between broadcasts. And also, because it's radio, you can't assume that people have heard the first lecture or the second lecture, right? Like, people may be coming to the lecture series in the middle of it. And so there is a certain amount of, like, catching up the audience and repeating concepts that comes through, or at least an effort to do so for the radio format that maybe muddies up the clarity a little bit more than if it had just been a short book. Having said that, it's still really good stuff. And I think if the listeners are interested, it's also possible to like get the lectures on at least on CD from the CBC. So you can actually listen to Beer deliver these lectures as opposed to reading the book.
Nice. Yeah. Okay, I need to check that out then. But yeah, I suppose we might as well just dive straight in. First lecture is titled "The Real Threat to All We Hold Most Dear," and it opens with Beer kind of recounting this experience of the coast of Chile with this little cottage he was spending some time at, and the sort of majestic waves rolling in the bay and crashing over the rocks and all this sort of stuff. And he's clearing his head, right? And he's appreciating getting away from the pace, the pressure, the complexity, the activity of modern life. And in reflecting on this, he's kind of like that. Well, all that sort of rapidity and pressure and all this kind of chaos is kind of structural, right? Like it's in the structure of the economy, the structure of the institutions, and in particular, like human life has got more complex recently, like compared to where it was in the pretty recent past. And then he shares the doubts that a lot of us have about like the kind of fitness for purpose of a lot of these institutions and the kind of the social machinery that we live in. That it doesn't seem to be actually working anymore, basically. Which is a sense we all get. I mean, he got this sense in 1973, and I mean, oh boy, 2018 has not been kind either.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, this is a significant time that he's delivering these lectures, right? Because it is just after Pinochet's coup overthrowing the Allende government, and talking about systems that have not worked. He certainly has had his fairly personal experience with organizational failure and collapse, and just the immediate past. He's giving this example of the waves, right? The waves on the ocean, and how they're a dynamic system in catastrophe. It's pretty resonant given given what he's just been through and what Chile has just been through.
Oh, very much so, yeah. I mean, the thing he begins from here is that, like, kind of asking the question of why is it that, like, our social institutions seem to be in chaos and collapse. And one of the reasons he gives is that we view institutions as entities, like singular entities, but we should really be viewing them as dynamic systems, as, like, interrelated parts and connections, and so on, and that we're kind of usually not actually accustomed to thinking in that kind of way. And the analogy with the waves then is that if you look at the waves in the bay, each wave appears to be a singular object that has these characteristics of like, it's made of water, it's got a shape to it, there's a little white crest at the top and that sort of thing. However, that apparent entity, the apparent singular entity, is actually the output of a dynamic system hidden beneath the waves. And crucially, the white crest at the top of the wave that you're seeing is not a kind of, it's not to be taken as like a defining characteristic of the wave. It's actually a sign of doom, because those white crests only develop when the wave is about to hit the shore, And it's like he's asking you to look beneath the appearance of the thing, look beneath the individual entity and see the sprawling, resonant processes and systems beneath it that give rise to the thing that's apparent in your experience, right? And it's instability, right? Like the wave is becoming unstable as it approaches the shore. The little white crest appears, gives that little sign of turbulence, and it's just doom, really. And this is like, there's a resonance there, right? Like there's like this wave instability. And social instability.
He's it's also sort of a cautionary thing that he is saying there, right? Is that we can look out from our little cottage on the coastline at the waves and see them as these like very happy little things, right? But from a different point of view, they're actually doomed, right? There's a catastrophe there. So it is, he's kind of saying the same thing about society or social institutions, right? Is that they can seem, from an unexamined perspective, to be more stable than they actually are, or to be functioning better than they actually are, or to be more impressive than they actually are, if you don't look beneath that output to what the dynamics of the system involved are, and then you can recognize something different.
Yeah. And the point he moves on to is that, like, there's a difference between the two, in that waves are, they're dynamic, but they're not viable. The wave isn't destined to go on forever. It sort of, more or less is going to run aground, or it's going to collapse in some kind of way. It's just in the nature of what waves are. But this word viable is important, right? Like that viable systems are systems that adapt and survive, that they have a kind of continuing identity in time. And they can collapse, they can go away, they can diminish and fade out, or they can rejuvenate, they can go in all sorts of different directions, but there is that notion of viability as the continued ongoing existence and continued adaptation of the thing. That, like, our institutions are, like, I mean, as the title of the lecture says, like, they enshrine everything we hold most dear, right? Like, we do actually kind of like our institutions and a lot of the effects they have. Well, some of them, you know. we are sort of fond of this, like, you know, freedom bit, and you know, there's a especially as Marxists tend to be pretty down on most, if not all, institutions in contemporary society, but, you know, there's something to like about a lot of them. There is an investment in them, right? Like we do actually like to live in a modern society and that, but, like, when these things are threatened, right, that, like, the usual approach is to reinforce the institution, right? This is the retrenchment and the kind of reaction you kind of get so often, right, to the encroaching threat. But Stafford's making the point here that that's a mistake. Like, that's entity thinking. That's thinking in terms of the singular entities, and we should instead be thinking in terms of what are these things and how are they outputs of underlying systems or clusters of systems.
Yes. Yeah, and this is not like a purely analytical process, right? Like, it's not just about breaking the institution down into component parts. It is also a more kind of like holistic or dialectical approach of systems thinking or process thinking to see how these elements or component processes of the system function on each other and make up an entity. So it's not just saying, like, oh, well, to really understand a thing, you need to chop it all up. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that, like, yeah, there's the apparent entity, but there are also processes that make it up, and we need to understand both of those things. Yeah, and crucially that, like, the entity can also be the result of combinations of hidden processes. That the entity contains processes, but it can also be something that arises as the result of essentially unknowably complex interactions between processes that are happening slightly out of sight, like with the wave, right? Like there's fluid dynamics and there's turbulence and stuff beneath the surface that just isn't apparent from the surface at all, and we need to be thinking in these sorts of terms. And Stafford sort of touches on this point here that, like, when we're trying to understand systems and organizations and institutions, we often reach for this usual hierarchical org chart, right, to understand things like, oh, the CEO is up here and then his lieutenants are beneath him and then blah, blah, blah. And that it's great for apportioning blame, but it doesn't actually describe the function of the organization. Right. Yeah, that's right. It's a kind of, like, very bad analysis. Very. Like, breaking it all, like, oh, the answer to entity thinking is to make more entities, right? Like, that's not what he's saying, right? Like, he's not saying, oh, well, you know, in order to understand an organization, you just need to understand all of the departments of the organization. No, it tells you very little, because that is this kind of entity thinking, not process thinking. Yeah, you need to understand the interconnections and the circuits and the flows and the feedback and all that sort of stuff. It's a much richer way of looking at organizations and institutions. But that's part of this diagnosis, right? That we generally don't think in these sorts of terms, and it shows because our institutions are kind of on the brink of collapse. It's, you know, but to demonstrate, like, this is where we start to get into, like, using examples and kind of little sketches and, you know, models to try and explain some of the underlying concepts here. And Stafford starts with this, like, what is on paper a rather baffling analogy until you see the drawing. At the back of the chapter. And I can't imagine how this must have been received on radio. Yeah. So the analogy is to a sort of a ball and rope and poles and people sort of thing. So we begin by imagining, you know, two poles with people sitting on top of them, and they're holding a rope between them, you know, facing each other.
And from the middle of the rope, you have a small little string, and there's a ball at the end of the string. So it's hanging down halfway between them. And, there'll be little disturbances as they wiggle the rope back and forth. And the ball will move around in the middle. And it's crucial to understand that the position of the ball at any given time is the output of this system. And its internal state is that of the two people sitting on the poles and the position of the rope. There'll be a bit of jostling, and a bit of instability, but eventually the ball will settle down to a relatively stable position. But there are really too many possible states of the system, right, for it to be easily regulated. There's too much variety. That's the term that's introduced here. Where variety is the number of possible states a system can have. So an example might be traffic lights, where if you think about the traffic lights, there are 4 states. There's off, and then red, orange, and green. I haven't seen a traffic light in ages. Is that the way they're laid out?
Yes.
So there's only 4 states, and for the people that are of the computer science bend, you realize that like 4 states can be fit into 2 bits, right? Like, and it's a measure of the variety of the thing. Dice, another decent example, that like a 6-sided dice has 6 possible states, a 20-sided dice has 20 possible states. So we would say that they have variety of 20 for a d20, or a variety of 6, and that like 2 d20s together has a variety of 20 squared, that like 10 of them has 20 to the power of 10, and so on. Just a measure of the possible states, but it's a very important thing to get, because it's a kind of a proxy for complexity, and it's a measure of the possibility of the system. And then if you're going to be trying to regulate systems, you're going to want to keep an eye on this kind of stuff, right? That like, how many possible states can it be in? What is the variety of the system? But then a cat comes along and, takes a swipe at the ball, and there's chaos, right? And the 2 guys at the tops of the poles are left desperately trying to get the ball to come back to a stable position. It's a fun analogy,
If you're having a little bit of trouble visualizing or conceptualizing this, you can actually get this book for free on the Internet Archive. Just look for Designing Freedom, and if you go to page 14, 15, there are little diagrams, 14, 15, 16, there are little diagrams that Stafford Beer drew to help illustrate this, and they're really quite useful to take a look at. So if you want to go and just quickly take a look at that, it may help to understand this analogy.
Yeah, because it's not particularly easy to understand either in text or in audio, I think. One of the other crucial ideas here that's introduced very early is that of relaxation time, which is the average time between disturbances. So the cat comes along and takes a swipe at the ball, and that's a disturbance. And if they take a swipe another minute later, that's another disturbance. And the kind of thing here is that in order for the system overall to be relatively stable, it needs to have a relaxation time that is shorter than the time between disturbances. It has to, it's cool down, right? Like it has to do its cool down period before the next problem arises.
Yeah, and it's pretty obvious, right, that if your system does not come to relaxation before the next disturbance, then you're going to have progressive amplification of the disturbance, right? Because it's just every time you go through the cycle, there is going to be more added to the system.
It'll just get worse, constantly worse. The example continues by adding more poles, and they're all joined in the center to this thing. So you've got 30 or 40 poles with people on top of them, and the ropes, and they're all kind of tied together. And this is going to be very complex, right? It's a very high variety system with everyone tugging on the ropes, and you can imagine that the output state of the little ball at the bottom is going to be very, very chaotic. But our institutions are like this, right? They are high variety systems. And the way that you get these kinds of high variety systems under control is you do variety engineering on them. Usually variety reduction, right? Like you want to get it under control so you can get to a lower relaxation time. And there's rather sort of like fun, rundown of how this is usually done, like the traditional way of doing it. One of the ways is to introduce hierarchy. So you install another set of ropes on a level above, and like higher pillars that people are sitting on, bosses that are like connected to 4 or 5 other people. Or you like restrain the system. You install new little ropes between the people so that they limit their, or you like put chains on them or something so that they can't move very much. Or you shoot the cat, which is what a lot of institutions actually do, is they decide that all these disturbances coming in from the environment are intolerable. We have to get rid of whatever is causing the disturbances.
And the 3 ways that Beer sort of summarizes this is 3 of the main ways by which institutions reduce their variety. Number 1, a boss constrains the freedom of his subordinates. Number 2, rigid connections called rules constrain the interactions of the elastic threads. And the example he uses here visually is basically what you might be familiar with from like a spider's web, right? You put lines in between the lines to add more rigidity to the system. So if one goes up, it's going to pull against another rope, and then that'll create a certain kind of stability. And then number 3, someone shoots the cat. The institution does not accept arbitrary interference and forces those with whom it interacts into stereotypes. And in this case, the stereotype is dead.
Because we can't tolerate this input.
Yeah, it is a sort of, funny example. There's a poor little cat that is like in the picture. It's got its hind legs up in the air, like R.I.P. cat. But in real life as well, this is a very common way to deal with these problems, right? Like, you look at like the Pentagon saying like, oh, all this, failed states and religious extremism and stuff. So what is the solution? Well, we'll just, send out these counterinsurgency teams to kill people all over the world. Drone people, right? Like those are actual ways that institutions deal with variety, is to force people into the stereotype of dead.
A sort of a less extreme example sort of popped into my head as well of like, I think a lot of us that work in technology or in sort of businesses will kind of be familiar with like the kind of dysfunction where a business decides to get rid of its customers, basically. That like the burden of having customers is too much, and the business decides to self-immolate by making a decision that like gets rid of all their customers. That's the way they shoot the cat.
It's exactly what happened with Tumblr, right?
Yeah. Precisely what happened, like, actually. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's like, oh, well, like, we can't sort out the variety here, right? Like, there's the sexual content or sexualized content that people want on here, and then there's also, like, the child pornography on here, and we don't know how to sort out this variety, so we're just going to get rid of all of it, right? It's literally the shooting of the cat, right? Like, that is what they did. And yeah, they basically decided to just eliminate their user base because there's too much variety and they didn't know how to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, this is dysfunctional, right? Like, this is these are not good ways to manage systems, right? Like, but like Stafford's kind of diagnosis here is that the institutions we have, by and large, were set up quite a while ago for a much simpler world, and now we find ourselves in a much more varied world, and such that the relaxation time is longer than the time between disturbances, right? That like the institutions we have are in many ways just insufficient, right? Like they're not good enough, and the solution that Stafford is going to outline across the next 5 lectures is that we're going to solve this by doing better variety engineering, essentially. That like we need to always be thinking about variety in systems and thinking about ways we can make regulatory systems couple effectively to other systems.
Yeah, and just like one more example that sort of comes to mind with that is like the collapse of the Roman Republic, right? Like there was a certain constitutional order that was set up in the Roman Republic way before the advent of the empire, and it was able to grapple with a certain degree of variety. And there were modifications and changes made to it, and certain additions and adaptations and new rules and all that kind of thing. But at a certain point, the variety became too much, right? And therefore, even reforms to the system, reforms to the Constitution, actually just aggravated the problem. Until you had the Republican system collapse and the Constitution becoming largely a formality, and the establishment of the empire, which was a system that was able, for a while at least, to grapple with a greater degree of complexity. And this is very much adding the boss in control of his subordinates, right? This is very much,
Install more poles. More poles.
A higher pole. Yeah. Put the emperor up on the highest pole.
Yeah. But yeah, didn't work before, and it's not gonna work again. So we're going to have to come up with much better ways of managing this stuff. And so Stafford's got a few answers for us, right? Like, or at the very least, he has tools, right? Like tools that have a kind of information theoretic or like mathematical basis, I suppose, to explain, well, what is the problem in the first place? Oh, the problem's variety. Well, how can we grapple with that? Well, here's a toolbox. There's a couple of things in it, So yeah, if we move on to the second lecture, The Disregarded Tools of Modern Man, we get this quite a nice opening where it's just a sort of defense of like why it's necessary to make this like a scientific endeavor. That like the great thing about science is that it allows us to make general statements about the world. The same is true about institutions and organizations, right? Like, and the science of I love his definition for cybernetics here, right? Like that cybernetics is the science of effective organization, and that if you're doing organization without cybernetics or something equivalent to it, you are doing pre-scientific management. It's like building bridges before people understood physics. Like they could build them, kinda, not very well. But they also couldn't, reason about what the hell was going on. That like each new bridge that they would build would have to be just attempted from scratch, and sometimes they fell down because they couldn't work it out on paper beforehand. That was pre-scientific physics. We are stuck in that mode of pre-scientific management when it comes to managing complex modern societies. And like the argument here is that like, society should use its scientific tools to redesign its institutions. We have these tools, but they're disregarded at the moment, which is it's a nice. There's a lot of resonance between this and what we saw in Feenberg in Transforming Technology. That like the technoscience has this potentiality to create stable, hypermodern, liberated societies, but we're stuck in a local minima currently. that doesn't do that.
Yes. I think the important thing here to keep in mind is that we're sort of delving into this talk about organizational science, and that may feel very kind of like dry business school sort of stuff. And certainly that is the background that Beer comes from, right? Like the operations management and stuff like that. That's where his background was. But really, this is all towards the end of more liberated society, right? Like there is a point to this. It's not just about having, a more like a better functioning tax office or something like that, right? So
I think
something to keep in mind.
I think there's a defense though for even the drier sort of portion of that. Like if the audience for this is socialists, right? And socialists who give a shit about technical stuff and about organizations and things. Like if you think you're going to take over the state and run it, and you don't give a shit about institutions, I've got news for you, buddy. Like, come on.
Yeah, 100%.
Oh boy.
It is.
Like you need to give a shit about this. You need to.
Exactly. You need to, and there is a link between this stuff and the freedom that we actually want, right? Like, that is the main point, is that, like, you can't simply either flail around in this very, like, pre-scientific way, trying to get the ends that you want, or just pretend that organizations don't matter and behave in this very idealist way about, oh, well, I wish we could just be free, or I wish that we lived in a simpler society, or, any of this kind of thing. Yeah, wouldn't it be nice if, like, all this kind of stuff, it's not going to get you anywhere. And these are tools for grappling with actually existing complexity towards the ends of greater freedom in our lives.
Yep. Yeah, important stuff. Very. So the sort of major thing that crops up here is a bit of a clarification about variety. In that, like we're talking about like having systems that regulate other systems, essentially, and that in order to regulate a system, you have to absorb its variety. Stafford's pretty particular about this word, right? Like it's kind of like meeting its variety, but also kind of absorbing it, right? Like there's something in the way he puts this that's quite nice. And the thing is that the only thing that can absorb variety is variety, right? Like other variety. And this is Ashby's law of requisite variety, which is pretty important and like foundational to Stafford's work. The argument is essentially that, like, if you have a complex thing and you want to control it, you need to be as complex as that thing, kind of, right? Like, there's a bit of wiggle room there, because there's an obvious problem in that if you're as complex as it, well, aren't you going to need regulation? And who's introduced, like, you need a third system to regulate you, but that needs to be as complex. And so that's kind of intractable, right? Like, and also we have to keep in mind that, like, in reality, real systems out there in the world outside of our own skulls are like unknowably complex, like what we were getting to in the cybernetic brain all those episodes ago. So it feels intractable, but the thing is, like, if you do variety engineering, you can get close, right? Like, you can get close enough to cope with the variety coming from the system and to do effective regulation in practice. That's what we're getting to here. It's not theoretically ideal regulation, but it's good enough in practice that you can actually steer the thing.
Yes. Yeah, because, of course, if you just look at the law of requisite variety on its face, you think, well, in order to achieve anything, we need an infinite amount of resources,
yeah,
right? Which we don't have.
No.
So how does anything work at all? If you need variety to cope with variety, feels like it's just going to be an endless sort of spiral of management problems or regulatory problems. But yes, you can actually do things more intelligently than just throwing more resources at the problem.
Yeah, and the sort of two ways of grappling with this are to attenuate or reduce the variety of the system, or to amplify the regulatory variety. Now, this takes some explaining, right? We're going to have to go through some examples here. One of the examples that Stafford uses is customers in a store, right, like a department store. And this is a very high variety interaction, right, that, like, the customers come in with all sorts of expectations, they have all sorts of needs, unpredictably many needs, in fact, right, like the customers are high variety. But the store has to absorb their variety somehow, right, like it has to do it somehow. For, like, a car dealership, one of the ways you do that is you assign a salesperson to each customer, right? Like, so you're actually matching the variety one to one. Like a human being has quite a bit of variety, but you attach another human being to them, and that's what absorbs their variety, like, and completes the sale or whatever. For a department store or something like that, that's kind of not practical, right? Like, you can't have hundreds or thousands of staff on the floor going around tailing each of the customers. So what you do instead is you get clever, right? Like, you attenuate the variety of the customers by dividing the store up into departments or splitting it into binaries. So the customer comes in and they want both cheese and shoes. However, they don't need both cheese and shoes at the same time. So you can put those in two different departments. There's a shoe department and there's a cheese department. So that helps that the store is reducing the variety they have to deal with in any given moment. One way of amplifying variety is to hire specialists or train the staff to be really smart and to be really effective at their job, right? Or to, connect and communicate to like amplify the variety of the store as a kind of regulatory system. And then you have an information desk to soak up the last remaining bits of variety. That if the thing that the person, the customer is up to, just doesn't fit the mold at all, there has to be some sort of a sink into which their variety can go, which is just the information desk.
Yeah, and this is for any of the coders and the hackers in the audience. Of course, this is just exception handling, right?
Yeah. You have to have something sort of a thing of last resort to catch the scenarios. I like this analogy. I was surprised to read it. I was like, oh, actually, that is interesting, because there's a bit of a problem with some of these drawings where they of systems coupled to each other with feedback loops. That they're often drawn in such a way that you would expect it to be about systems that have a single input and a single output, and it's like a very simple electrical circuit. However, this is a really great example because there's so much going on. Like it's a nonlinear interaction. There isn't a simple kind of in and out to it, and the regulation is complex, and it's recognizably complex because it's something that's from our everyday lives, and it is analogous to the kind of regulatory stuff that you have in institutions we care about, right? Because a department store seems like a very mundane kind of example, but you can start thinking about this stuff in terms of I don't know, whatever parts of the state manage the economy, or parts of firms that have to manage internal operations, or all sorts of things, right?
Because it is we all have our own particular workplaces, but as consumers in capitalist society, we are united in our experience of interaction with the productive side of the economy, right? Like we've all had that experience of the department store, whereas every little bureaucracy in the workplace is somewhat particular. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very much so. But the thing here is that if the store fails to absorb, or if they fail to match requisite variety, it's a loss of control, which for a store means desertion, essentially, that they're going to eventually go out of business. For an institution like, I don't know, Britain's Home Office, where you don't have a option to interact with them or not, you can't really desert them, but it does cause its own catastrophic failures. Or just extrapolate for any institution you can name. And by institution here we mean state institutions and businesses and sites of production, sites of consumption, all sorts of things, right? We're not talking strictly in terms of one of these categories. It's if you can name an organization, these principles apply to it. That is the general theory here. Remember, at the beginning of the chapter, general statements. That's what science is. It's and we're talking about the science of effective organization in general, not just specific to any given sector of the economy. I think we've covered a lot of that. Effective variety engineering, we've got filtering, putting into categories, or making the regulatory part, such as the salespeople and such, smarter and more effective. But either way, you're trying to bring the variety in the system you care about into line with the variety of the system that's regulating it. For a very abstractive definition of regulation, because you wouldn't ordinarily think of a department store as regulating anything, right?
Right. I mean, there is a certain reification of their organization because they're a thing that we're all used to experiencing from our childhood throughout our lives, right? They've been around for such a long time, and they all just seem very natural. But No, I mean, the actual creation of the department store in the first place was an innovation, a significant organizational innovation of taking various shops that were scattered all over Paris or whatever and putting them in one place together in a kind of organized way, like intentionally organized way, so as to get benefits from that organization, right? Like the manner in which the department store grapples with its variety is in some ways more advantageous than the previous existing form of organization, which was a number of scattered shops all over the place, right?
Yeah.
And you know, those certainly were able to grapple with a certain amount of variety, but there was also a cost that was imposed on the consumers because of that.
Yeah. Indeed. So Stafford then gets back into kind of complaining about the state of the current system, the way things are rigged up. And one of his main points here is that, like, the way we use variety amplifiers and attenuators in our sort of institutional systems is kind of backwards, where we put the attenuators and the amplifiers in the wrong part of the loop. Essentially,
this is a very important point.
Yeah,
very important point.
This is important and tricky. So, like, one of the examples he leans on is, like, computing and telecommunications and stuff. That, like, by and large, computers have been deployed in such a way as to make the existing workflows even higher variety than they were already, which makes them even less controllable. And the computers are by and large not being deployed in the regulatory part of the loop. So it takes an already unstable situation, like, you know, it takes the administrative workflows of the quill pen, replaces the quill pen with the computer, and changes nothing else. You've still got quill pen administration going on. And of course the thing flies off the fucking rails. And the computer is so often the site of blame for things going wrong, right? That, like, I think he comes back to a couple of times across the lectures that, like, we blame the computers for the instability instead of using them to counter the instability, which is what you're supposed to do with them, you know?
Yes, and the reason why this happens is because using them in an organizational fashion would actually imperil the existing arrangement and the existing job descriptions and prestige of the administrators who are in charge of those functions, right? So this is very much getting back to Feenberg and this technical code, right? Like that the reason the computers are not used in that way is because the technical code seeks to download problems onto workers instead of actually adjusting the manner of management.
Yeah. There's an example, I don't know if it's in this chapter specifically, but or if it's later on, where he's, like, saying that, like, from his experience in the steel mills, he saw a wave of technical innovation come in, and the managers would tell the steel workers that they were now irrelevant. You know, they were getting fired. But then the next wave of innovation was the computer stuff, and the same managers didn't allow themselves to be made obsolete by the computers. You know, that, like, there had to still be a place for them. So this is important. Yeah, it's resonant with the work of Feenberg in transforming technology, and it's part of, like, Stafford's, like, partial and sort of confused class analysis. In places he recognizes this dynamic very clearly, but in other places he sort of doesn't. Like, he's not the clearest of sort of thinkers when it comes to the class stuff. But it's there. It is definitely there. Like,
absolutely. When it gets into sort of more concrete examples, he tends to be a little bit better with the class analysis. And when it gets into kind of, like, woolly abstractions about the public good, he's not really quite so on point with that. But nevertheless, there's a lot of, like, especially if you read this stuff in terms of what we saw with Feenberg, There's a ton of useful ideas here. And just to clarify this point about the quill pen administration, the problem with applying computers to quill pen administration is that, like, you just get tons and tons of meaningless data, right? Like you are proliferating the amount of papers and data sets and printouts and analytical models and all this kind of stuff. The kinds of things that people can kind of do themselves to some degree using a pen and paper and an abacus or whatever, but just like making more and more and more and more and more of that. And what that ends up doing is overloading the people who are supposed to interpret that paper or that data, and you're aggravating the problem, right? Like, because you are just producing more and more stuff to be analyzed and read, rather than reorganizing things so that what is analyzed well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the regulatory part of the regulatory system remains impoverished. It's just that its job has gotten a lot worse. Yeah, I mean, but there's an interesting kind of it's a sort of negation of the accelerationist Landian sort of view of like, oh, computers everywhere, networks, whoa, banking, amazing, food, look, everything's fast now. And Beer's like, nah, yeah, it is very fast and very shiny, but that's bad because it's wildly unstable and vastly more unstable than it was before, and that's what Nick Land loves, right? He loves the instability of it. There's a wonderful mirror relationship here between the perspectives on the same thing, right? Yeah. I think Beer is a much more sober thinker than Land. He's got his finger on the pulse of like what the actual underlying information technical dynamics are, which is ironic because that's the thing that Nick claims to have and consistently fucks up.
Well, yeah, I mean, Beer had a lot more experience with actually implementing and analyzing the implementations of these technologies, as opposed to someone like Nick Land, who is just a academic, just kind of looking at isolated reportage and pop culture things here and there, right? Like, it is the Landian analysis is very like impressionistic of what was going on, whereas what Beer is talking about is really informed by actual experience with administrative and organizational failure.
Yeah. But remember the thing from the very beginning of the book, though, right? That you have to look beyond the appearances and the apparent entities. You have to look at the actual underlying systems. Beer is able to do that because he's not out of his fucking mind on meth, right? Whereas Land, there's just beautiful irony in this, that Land claims to be doing that, to be slipping out of the subjective position and immersing in that kind of techno-Deleuzian nightmare world of interconnected stuff, but he's not. He's just taking the impressions at face value like a moron. and our boy Beer has a much better take on things, I think. Yeah, we couldn't go one episode without getting a fucking dig in against Land,
Oh yeah, I mean, there is no greater burn than that graph showing the value of Bitcoin. It's like the release of his book on Bitcoin, celebrating its great triumphs, was exactly timed to coincide with the crash of the value of Bitcoin. It's it's so beautiful.
Oh boy. Yeah. Do we have much more to cover in this chapter? I think we've got most of it.
Yeah, I think it might be just a little bit useful to read this section from his notes at the end of the chapter, which says how to use the computer according to cybernetic principles. So the positive example, right? The public is conceived of as a system, a model of which is contained in the computer. The public supplies minimal information, which the computer then synthesizes in the model. This amplifies variety as required to help the public and attenuates variety to help the manager, thereby meeting the requirement of the law of requisite variety for each of them. So the important thing here is that the public supplies minimal information, right? This is very, very different from the way that we typically use computers, right? We just want to put sensors on everything, like more sensors. We need like, this is like the absurdity of the smart home, right? Like, oh, well, we just need to put sensors on everything. The Internet of Things. We'll need to do that for everything. We need to have, surveillance systems that just have like visual sensors and audio sensors and we need to have Fitbits, and we need to have every kind of sensor you could possibly imagine at all times in all places, collecting all types of information. That is absolutely not what Beer is advocating here, because he has a certain degree of trust in the lower levels of the system to provide relevant information, right? That, the sensor is very much a dumb pipe that just gets the information, and then that information can be aggregated at higher levels. And that is a kind of model that appeals to a very sort of ignorant administrative mindset, right? Which ignores the capacities of the administered, right? And what he is proposing, and I think he says something to the effect of this, is that, like, we don't need the fanciest whiz-bang computers. We don't need the fanciest sensors. What we need is a good model that is respectful of the capacities of each level of the organization. And like, because, he's saying, like, well, look, like Project Cybersyn, which I was working on, we didn't have good computers. We had these, like, awful, teletype machines. But we were still able to get things done because we thought about the model intelligently, and we respected the capacities of each level of the system, as opposed to trying to create a centralized bureau that would just collect all of the data from everywhere and then make tons and tons of very complex models that people who are completely isolated from the relevant context would then interpret, which is the general way that we seem to do these things.
Yeah. It's good. It's really, really nice stuff. It's, I don't know, it's just so, it's so promising. It's promising that it's a solution to these sorts of problems that doesn't just involve more of the same, like of like, oh, well, if this massive pile of machinery is not working, we need twice as much, that kind of shit. Or like, oh, we need even more data collection. We need even bigger supercomputers and stuff. And he's saying, no. A couple of computers and a smart program will perform a lot better than proliferating more and more and more variety in the wrong part of the system.
Yeah, and I was just reading an article the other day about it was kind of a autobiographical memoir of a soldier who had fought in the recent wars in the Middle East, right, following 9/11, right, and his sort of disillusionment with the military. And one thing he mentioned was that, like, as infantry, or just as soldiers, like, they were constantly being assigned new gadgets and technologies, and like there was a lot of churn in what they were assigned, because like they were really just being used as product testers in order to fulfill this endless need for accumulation of technical instruments in order to fulfill these like capitalist imperatives of all of these manufacturers, arms manufacturers and instrument manufacturers, and you need to have all this stuff happen because that's what's driving innovation in the consumer sector as well, right? Like, it's just on and on and on with no thought, like lots and lots of thought put into the engineering of individual artifacts, but no comprehensive sort of cybernetic understanding whatsoever, right? Yeah, and it just goes all the way through our society.
Yeah, it is absolutely endemic, right? Like, yeah, it's just like variety being pumped into the wrong parts of systems constantly, and like it's inflating at faster and faster rates, and we're all losing our fucking minds trying to keep up with it. Yeah, bad shit. Stafford does have something like getting towards solutions, though, in the coming chapters. He's going to start out with kind of like talking at the level of the state and at the level of the entire economy, though, in Lecture 3, A Liberty Machine and Prototype. So we're talking about redesigning governance here. And there's this wonderful little phrase of like liberty machines, social machines that produce freedom as their output, which I quite like. So we're getting there, right? We're getting to this notion of like designing things deliberately to have particular kinds of outputs, rather than, leaving it up to the market to decide or some dumb shit like that. And, he begins with the point that, like, these same cybernetic principles apply. Like, we have, these are models, right? Like, they're abstracted out from systems, and they apply everywhere, essentially. Yeah, and he sort of begins with an analysis of, like, the problems of the current sort of way states and, like, these high-level institutions are run, right? That, like, you've... They try to reduce variety, but they do it by department, and the problem with that is that, like, these departments change too slowly to soak up excess variety, and there's a lot of variety left unmapped, right? Like, the one thing that jumped immediately to my mind was, like, ecology and, like, climate change, right? Like, there's vast variety in the world that remains completely unmapped in these like, institutional systems.
Definitely.
Yeah, and like it's gonna fucking kill us, right? Like that. It's that variety remaining unmapped is lethal. But that's just one example of I mean, fucking count them. Like how many examples could you come up with of this kind of thing of like these institutions being unable to map variety? Yeah.
Yeah, and even like when we have these. Enormous scientific bureaucracies and like administrative bureaucracies constructed to deal with problems like climate change, they oftentimes do fail to model properly or attenuate properly in ways, for example, like making climate change a problem of carbon, right? Or even conceptualizing the problem that we find ourselves in as a problem of climate change. Like, actually, like, this has been a thing this year, is like people pointing out, like, hey, yeah, climate change is a huge problem that we're causing. And within that problem, you can see the people who are criticizing the idea of the, like, emphasizing carbon too much, saying like, oh, well, there's other greenhouse gases we also need to look at. But then even looking at the climate change frame, it's like, well, also, we're destroying all of the biodiversity on the planet at a terrifying rate, and that is not simply because of climate change, right? So, there are all of these problems of modeling, organization, attenuation, amplification that are going on here, and we're really just not doing a good job of it.
Uh-huh. Yeah, real bad fucking job. Yeah, and a couple of the sort of reasons for this that, like, Beer lays out are kind of, like, really bad modeling that's, like, entity-based rather than systems-based. It, like, considers static time frames. It, like, considers individual, like, say, firms and sectors of the economy in isolation, or, sectors of the world in isolation without considering, complex feedbacks between them. Yeah, all that is also doubly true on the sort of environmental level as well. Aggregation, the bad kind of aggregation, stands out here as a really interesting one, where he's talking about, like, totals and averages being the kind of main measure of things. And it's kind of foolish when he points out, it's a foolish way to think about things when he points out that, like, imagine if you were a doctor and you walked into a ward and there was just a sign that said, over the last 24 hours, the patients in this ward have had, on average, X temperature. And you'd be like, that's fucking useless. it's an aggregate and it has trimmed variety in a way, but it's done it in an absolutely worthless manner.
Yeah.
That is quite nice, you know.
I mean, like, that could be true, and also all the patients in the ward could be dead.
Precisely. They've had on average 0 degrees Celsius as their temperature. Worthless, like worse than useless. But that's the main currency of how we sort of organize and deal with data, right? Like that, this kind of bad aggregation, and lag, right? That like decisions are being taken out of phase with the actual systems that they're supposed to be managing. So you have like a 6-month or year-long lag between like the analysis of a situation or the situation happening, and then eventually you come to a decision that's completely out of phase with action that's actually required. Ooh,
yeah,
boy.
And I feel like when he talks about the aggregation issue and the lag issue, these are issues that he suggests really have technical fixes. If we think about them in the right way, we can provide technical fixes to them. For example, we can get real-time statistics instead of having statistics that take 6 months to compile. We kind of saw that in Red Plenty, right? Like that kind of question coming up. And I think to a certain degree, or like we have solutions to some of the problems that he was talking about back in 1973 now, because we have way better sensors, we have way better communication technology, we have way better computing technology. We don't necessarily aggregate very well all the time. And certainly, despite the quality of our technology, there is a lot of administrative lag that still happens.
Yeah, that's a killer. Because you can collect all the data you want in real time, but if it sits on a hard drive in an Excel spreadsheet for 6 months before it's actually looked at by whoever's supposed to look at it, like that.
Well, just to return to that climate change issue. Like, look at how awful our global apparatus for addressing climate change models is, right? Like, it's like, the model comes out, and then years later, the deliberations have reached a certain stage, and then by then, like, there's already new data coming out, right?
It's like what we talked about with in the cybernetic brain, right? That like. These sort of incredibly complex systems can only be coupled to in performance, right? That like a lot of this kind of like modeling and the representational stuff is kind of a waste of time if by the time you've actually built them, aggregated all your data and collected all that data, that like it's the thing has just moved from under you, But that I think that has the cybernetic brain has the advantage of like Pickering writing 50 years after Beer was writing, so that realization is a bit closer to the surface.
Yes, yeah. And the point that Beer is making about modeling, I think, is really perhaps the strongest for us today, because that is not something you solve with technical fixes. Of course, you can use technology to help you model. That's always been true. But it seems like we still continue so many decades later to fail in that regard. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we really do. It's so, between reading this book and reading Brain of the Firm, it's been weird just how much of Stafford's writing feels like it could have been written last year, The way he describes problems and the way particularly the way he describes institutional problems and pathologies at organizational levels, they're imminently recognizable today. It's like, wow, have we not moved since he was writing? Like. It's depressing that my first-hand experience of working in a governmental institution matches precisely his experience of 1950s, governmental institutions.
Yeah, a lot of the organizational forms that we find in our society were either first created, basically created in a period between let's say the 1870s and the 1960s. And we have had some organizational innovations that we've come up with here and there, like, agile development, right? Like that is something that's very different from the organizational mentality of the 1950s. But, the implementation is still wanting relative to the preponderance of these old institutions, which are the institutions that Beer was responding to in this lecture series. And we haven't really managed to get past them or to adjust them or adapt them or, as he will say later in the lectures, basically smash them and create institutions and organizations that are sensitive to requisite variety in a far more intelligent way.
Yeah. And so in the next sort of section, he moves on to talking a bit more about proposing what that sort of systems would look like, and a lot of it hinges on basically worker participation and worker control, local intelligence, trusting the sort of various levels of the system. Because who is it that can realistically model these systems and regulate them? Well, it's the people closest to the coalface, isn't it? The people who sort of know the thing well. So it should be workers kind of building and managing these models. And he's talking about a recursive sort of jigsaw here, going from the level of the individual person to the team to the department to the firm to the sector to the whole economy as recursively nested cybernetic systems, essentially, of these kind of regulatory sorts. This is a very lightweight version of what he has in the viable system model in Brain of the Firm. It's a very nice intro to that, but it doesn't elaborate on the actual VSM bit. But that's the touch point there.
Right. Right. And the models that we have inherited are very much, they come from two sources, right? Or I guess I should say three. One is the church, right? The Catholic Church. Another is the military. And then the third is the factory, right? Those are where our organizational models originate. And those are all cross-pollinating between each other, right? But none of those models are interested in the intelligence or capacities of the worker, right? They're all very hierarchical top-down models.
And Stafford's taking his inspiration from a very different place here. He's talking about an economy that works like our own bodies, essentially. He's taking inspiration from bioorganic processes. He's taking inspiration from neuroscience and so on, right? He's taking a lot of inspiration from nature to as to how should viable systems be structured, and that's kind of where the viable system model came from, right? That looking at evidently viable systems such as organisms and extracting lessons from them, being how is this thing actually structured? And it's structured around local intelligence, right? That your lungs and your heart and your liver, by and large, just do their own thing without your conscious input. There's an automatic filtering mechanism where if the liver fails to do its own thing, it'll send an alert signal upwards, and suddenly the higher levels will start paying attention. But that's this kind of fundamental notion of leaving things, letting local intelligence do its thing, detecting novelty, and then alerting to higher levels is pretty integral to all this.
Yes, that is the minimal information that he is talking about.
And that's how you do variety reduction, right? Attenuation in a realistic way that doesn't just throw away important information, is that you just have the communication channel be silent most of the time, except for when the lungs notice that something is badly wrong and the nerves start to light up and it's now there's stuff there. So it's attenuating variety by leaving the variety to the local system to manage, essentially, leaving it to a lower level of recursion to take care of. And I, as a higher level system that's tasked with monitoring all these other things, I only really care when things go wrong. And that's how you manage to couple to that system effectively, is that you have a recursive coupling of systems nested inside each other, where, they trust the level below them. Yeah, I like it. It's quite nice. It's
yes.
Yeah, it's a shame that Brain of the Firm is so long, because it would be really nice to discuss it on the show, but boy, is it long. It's a monster book. Anyway, but Beer at this point in the lecture remarks that he's speaking with a lot of confidence here because he has seen it done in Chile, right, with President Allende. They built CyberSyn, and it basically worked, right? And there's a wonderful bit here that the people arm in arm with their science were to be the decision engine of the economy. That's pretty cool, right? That is a substantially better vision of a viable society than this train wreck we're occupying at the moment. Well,
there's that nice story of Beer talking to Allende, right? And he's showing Allende the VSM, the viable system model, and showing him this is how we're going to organize the economy, right? And there's the level 1 right at the top, that executive level. And he's like, oh, well, this will be you, Mr. President. And then Allende says, no, that is the people. Yeah. So maybe that was echoed a little bit in that line here in the lecture.
Yeah. System 5 is the people. It's a good.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. System 5. Yeah.
Well, the people are also System 1, but
yes,
we don't have the time to get too far into that. But the point here is that this is doable, but it's difficult, right? This is not a trivial proposition, but it is doable, and we should really set our sights higher, and actually try to do this. Lecture 4 is titled "Science in the Service of Man," and This one has quite a bit of resonance with transforming technology, actually. The argument is pretty much the same, which leaves me to wonder, why is it that Stafford Beer is not more well known, right? Why doesn't Beer pop up on Feenberg's radar? And that's not a dig against Feenberg. That's a rhetorical question of why doesn't Beer pop up on anyone's radar for this stuff?
Well, I remember I talked to Feenberg just after Ida Medina's book, Cybernetic Revolutionaries, came out, and he said that he had met her at a conference, and I think that was probably the first time he encountered that whole story, and I think it may be because the reception of Beer's work in the time that he was working on the left was quite hostile, which there was some bad press that he got in the British left, where there were all these accusations that he was designing a kind of tyrannical system of top-down cybernetic control, right? And it wasn't until later that image was sort of recuperated when people paid closer attention to what he actually did. Beyond that, I think there's just the fact that Beer was not an academic, right? He was, and he didn't have a strong institutional basis, as Pickering points out, right? In Cybernetic Brain, he was very much somebody who moved between spaces and was doing a lot of practical work, and teaching people to use the VSM. But I guess it's just, I think it is something that fell outside of any given academic disciplinary boundary, and wasn't really picked up because it was both sort of very practically oriented and also not not academic. Yeah, and then in the popular press, like, of course, he got this, Massey lecture that he got to do and stuff, but he wasn't really, like, politically involved at a major scale following this time, right? So yeah, it's. I think that really must be the thing, though, is that it just didn't fit into a disciplinary boundary, and so there weren't these mechanisms and institutions to reproduce his ideas and spread them outside of, like, the sort of group of followers he drew around him in organizational work.
Yeah, still kind of leaves me wondering, like, with I think there was that remark in the Cybernetic Brain that, like, at some point he'd approached in the 60s approached the Labour government in the UK to, like, create a national cybernetics service or whatever, National Institute of Cybernetics, and oh boy, what an alternate history that would be,
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, this is a point that we were talking about a little bit in preparing for the show, but he was addressing a lot of the same issues that neoliberals would end up addressing, in terms of sort of bureaucratic bloat and the oppression of the individual, and this kind of metastasizing bureaucracy taking over every aspect of life. But his prescriptions were very different from what the neoliberals had to say or what Hayek had to say or whatever. And I guess, if he had some institutional backing in something like the Labour Party, that might have helped to avert, that neoliberal direction, because it was addressing a lot of the same frustrations that, Thatcherism was addressing, right? His ideas were, but they didn't really have an institutional basis that Thatcherism had, right? Like, there was no Mont Pelerin Society for Stafford Beer's ideas.
Yeah. Which sort of touches on another episode of ours, like when we read the Accelerate Manifesto, right? Like, one of the calls there is to kind of establish what would be the equivalent of a Mont Pelerin Society, to push these sorts of ideas. Anyway, like, the argument of a lot of this chapter is that, like, modern science as we know it, like, is pretty much always used for, like, domination and alienation and the kind of, like, imposition of efficiency and so on. Like, it's very much the stuff we read about in Transforming Technology. But that's not the, inevitable only way of things. We can have a science in the service of man instead. And it's, he's against elite control of science and technology. He's for demystification of science. He's for the kind of, like, notion that the people are the specifiers, right? Like, that, like, the science has reached a point where it can implement more or less anything that's specified, and that, like, the people at large should be the specifiers of what is implemented.
This is such an interesting point.
Yeah. It's really, really cool.
And it really gets back to the stuff that, like, Graeber was saying, right, in the Flying Cars and Falling Ring of Profit, is that, like, the dismal circumstances we find ourselves in technologically are to a large extent the result of who has been specifying the direction of technological development and implementation. And it has not been the people. I mean, it has been, as Graeber points out, towards the end of surveillance. Like, I mean, I was just talking with a friend the other day, and, like, this is seriously not a joke. Like, this is really technology that is being developed and implemented, which is actual mood control of people remotely, like mood adjustment, like manipulating brain patterns so as to produce certain emotions and affects. And, like, this is like not tinfoil hat stuff. This is, like, actually things that DARPA is working on. This is the kind of thing that is being implemented. So, like think about what Beer is saying here. It's like, if you can think about it and specify it clearly enough, science can do it. There's a certain optimism about the power of science. But you look at an example like that, like, which is just absolutely out there, right? Like real just science fiction / like conspiracy theory weirdo land, right? But this is actually being done because there is so much effort and resources and intention into specifying technologies of management, discipline, and control, right? Because we are not in charge of the specification, because people in the Pentagon are in charge of the specification. It simultaneously goes to affirm his point, but it's also very depressing. That what we have to cope with as political activists going forward is not just tear gas. It's not just sonic cannons, which again is another thing that was very science fiction before. Like when I was growing up, I was like, "Oh, that'll never happen," but then it did. And now, like literal mass mind control technologies. Like this is what happens when we don't have any control over the specification. So yeah, there's general disenchantment with the power of science in a way that seems to make Beer's words ring hollow, right? Like oh, maybe like when I read that statement by Beer, I felt a certain amount of skepticism about the power of science, right? This kind of like postmodern disillusionment, right? Like, oh, like you're just too optimistic about what science can do. Like we don't have that much power. But then you look at examples like that.
Yeah, we don't have that much power.
No, yeah, we don't have that much power, but somebody does, and they are bending the power of science towards these incredibly perverse ends. Our disillusionment does not stem from the weakness of science so much as it stems from our own political weakness.
Yeah. Oh, very much so. Oh, this was simultaneously a kind of uplifting and depressing kind of read, because it's like, oh yeah, this description of a wonderful kind of future that we could have, and it's like, oh yeah, we're still stuck here. Yeah. Anyway, moving on a bit, we get to this section kind of about like the kind of really bad style of variety attenuation that's carried out on us. That like we start out from this pretty disadvantageous position where like we have finite brains, right? Like we have to own up to that. We as individuals only have so much variety, and that the complex problems, a lot of the complex problems we face in the world are simply unknowable at the individual level, right? Like climate change is not an individual problem. You're not going to fucking grapple with it as an individual, like mathematically, like we can prove it on fucking paper. Like you don't have the variety to do it. But we cope, right? Like we do modeling in our heads, we do simplifications, we have biases, but that's all very undirected and unscientific style of variety engineering, and it causes kind of wild oscillations and instability in the individual. I think as almost everyone listening to the show will be already familiar with. But we touch back on the notion of freedom here, right? That like in this sort of system where like we start out with very little variety of our own, but then our variety is attenuated even further by systems like education, like, which enforces conformity, or like, mass media, where like editorial decisions are taken at quite a distance from you. Your variety is attenuated even further instead of being amplified. Like education should amplify your variety, right? Like it should make you an even better person. But it seemingly doesn't, right? Like, I mean, you're an educator, right? Like, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I feel this so hard.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is a point where Beer and like Dewey definitely line up with each other. But so for example, my job has been mainly teaching English. English is a foreign language, and it is absolutely a system that is designed to produce this conformity and to attenuate. Because a major thing that I run into constantly in teaching is that people have been forced down this path of learning English in a very like top-down way, right? That like people have been so attenuated, the students have been so attenuated to just act as a recipient of the language that they can scarcely even imagine using it in any practical sense. Like, because that the variety that is necessary to actually think about the use and implementation of the language in an interaction with the world in a dynamic way has just been completely drummed out of them. And they've just been attenuated down to English equates things you study to do tests. And like it is an incredible struggle as a teacher to get them to think about the language in any practical way at all. That is absolutely an example of the sort of thing that he is talking about here. And I think that people have a very similar experience, to speak more generally, with math, right? With math, people have that kind of like getting it rammed down your throat, completely impractical, completely separated from any kind of context, sort of experience with math. And, of course, it's different because math is something that is much more abstract than English. But nevertheless, the point still stands, I think.
Oh, certainly. I mean, like, and it's a damn shame that, like, stuff that should be empowering and should be amplifying the variety of people, like, and, is doing the opposite. And, like, the point he sort of winds up here with is that meaningful liberty is kind of impossible in this sort of setup, right? That, like, if you're starting out as an atomized individual who only has, 10 to the 10 neurons available, and then your variety is being attenuated even further by these cultural, societal attenuators, how can you realistically be free? Like, the bourgeois notion of freedom is kind of fucking stupid in this kind of system, right? You can't. I mean, I'm free to wander into the gas station and buy either a Coke or a Pepsi. Well, such freedom is like, it just isn't. No, you're not free. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and it like, in my class sometimes I'll ask students like, well, like, what do you want to learn? Like, what would you like to study? What would you like to improve in your English? And when you present students with that degree of variety, they're just like a deer in the headlights, because their entire, 10 years of experience with the English language has just been about attenuating variety, right? They have no capacity to deal with any variety because they have no ways to model it, to understand it. And they have no experience of liberty with the subject matter. Like, the basic prerequisite of, are you even slightly interested in this subject, is never addressed in the education system. Right? Like, that is not a state of freedom. That is a state of oppression. And it is extremely oppressive to be teaching in a system like that too, because you feel the weight of the institution bearing down on you. Like that like, no matter what you want to do as a teacher, you're a part of this system, and this is what the system is doing. So yeah, it's absolutely true that none of this is a recipe for freedom. It's not designed with freedom in mind. That's for sure.
Well, yeah, like ring a ding ding. That's the title of the book, right?
Yeah.
Designing freedom.
Yeah.
And those are the sort of points that Stafford is going to try to sort of work up towards in the last couple of lectures, right? And like the fifth one is the future that can be demanded now. I have a feeling that these last two get a bit more woolly, and I think a lot of it is because he's recovering old ground to like keep people anchored, because it's been a week since the last broadcast. But there's still some stuff to talk about, though. One of the main big ideas here is that like the it's about freedom and cohesion, right? Like, I mean, there's classically been this kind of like dichotomy between, well, you can either have freedom or you can have societal cohesion, centralization versus decentralization, and Stafford thinks that's a false dichotomy. That viable systems operate on a very strange blend, oftentimes, of core and peripheral regulation that is kind of hard to pin down as either centralized or decentralized. I mean, the obvious example, your own body, right? Like, it's a weird mix of both, right? Like, if you're thinking in terms of just centralization and decentralization, you're kind of missing something very important about how real viable systems actually work. But, like, crucially, like, one of the arguments he makes here is that, like, the regulatory model is going to be in some way central, right? Like, the equivalent of, like, higher brain function and such is going to be centralized to some degree. But the variety that model is attenuating isn't simply thrown away; it's absorbed somewhere else. I think we went over this a couple of chapters ago, but like, yeah, that like it's being delegated to locally. It's not that it's being thrown on the floor. It's just that it's been handled closer to the source and hasn't reached the actual the central model.
Yes, and the important thing here is that this notion explodes the centralization-decentralization binary completely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it becomes irrelevant
because
yeah,
it is assumed that it's like you have a certain amount of capacity, and you can just move that to the periphery or to the core, and those are your two options. Those are the two ways you can organize a system. But Beer is saying, like, no, if you have this kind of recursive system, like the viable systems model, it is simultaneous, like these words kind of lose their meaning, right? Because it is centralized in the sense that there is central regulation, but it's also decentralized in the sense that a lot of the work and processing and dealing with variety is handled at the lower levels of the system, right? So this language of centralization, decentralization becomes kind of meaningless.
Yeah, and also that like each of those lower subsystems, or each of the subsystems, is itself a fully viable system with its own centralized like spinal column and periphery, and recursively so. Like it's that kind of recursive thing.
Yeah, it is really the recursion that renders the concepts of centralization, decentralization quite meaningless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, the present institutions we have are stuck in this fucking binary, and you often get this alternation between centralization and decentralization, right? That like in one moment a bunch of consultants come in and say, oh, it's too decentralized, we need to centralize stuff, and then they all get fired, and then a couple of years later another bunch of consultants come in and say, oh, too much center here, we need to diffuse it a bit, you know, and it's managerial psychosis. At an institutional level.
And as you know, he says this aggravates the instability in the system, right? Because you are messing with the organizational form again and again and again, and you're not getting that relaxation period anywhere. So it is. Well, I mean, anybody who has worked in one of these bureaucracies, like, I'm sure you understand completely how this works, because this is an ongoing phenomenon. It was happening in 1973, and it's still happening today.
Mm-hmm. We really haven't improved very much. Yeah, this is all imminently recognizable. So, I mean, we need fundamental change to get out of here, right? Because these really bad attenuators are written into our culture and into the technical code. You know, to touch back on Feenberg, right? Like the logic of our society encodes these kind of badnesses into it. But how do we get this change, right? This the next sort of question Beer brings up. And in order to really answer that, he wants us to understand the nature of resistance to change, right? That like by and large people. When you ask people about change, they're usually in favor of it. You know, they like novelty. You know, because people are viable systems, they're able to adapt to things quite well. But it's bureaucracies that are unable to adapt to change, or that actively resist it. And we're introduced to these two terms. First, the homeostat. A homeostat is a system that kind of achieves stability, where it manages to hold its output steady. And a good example of that is a thermostat, actually. It has a certain output, the temperature of the room, it holds it steady. Success. A homeostat which is ultra stable is one which holds its output steady, but also holds its internal organizational structure steady also. So it's like a higher level of stability, an ultra stability, if you will. And yeah, this is what kind of describes a bureaucracy, like inside a institution. Like you end up with an inner institution that achieves this kind of ultra stability for itself, and it means that its own survival becomes the main goal of its operation. And the original goal falls by the wayside as this horrible sort of bureaucratic tumor just takes on a life of its own.
Right. And, as we were saying in the sort of pre-show discussion, this is the sort of thing we see in governments all the time, but it's especially the sort of thing that, like, a show like The West Wing glorifies and celebrates. The ultra stability of the American state is really the most celebrated thing in that TV series. That, like, all this stuff about reaching across the aisle and finding compromises and all of the glorification of, like, how hard everybody's working on the inside and all this kind of stuff. It's all to serve this story about a ultra stable administrative system that doesn't actually achieve anything meaningful for people outside of it, but is very effective at ensuring that it is smooth and capable of reproducing its own existence. And, certainly for a liberal audience, who typically are people who tie their self-worth, their value, their life stories to a meritocratic educational system that will give access to bureaucratic institutions, that would have a lot of appeal. Because when you are socialized to work as hard as you can to get access to those upper echelons, the inner circles of this system, seeing that system, seeing meritocracy reflected in its operation and seeing its ultra stability are reassuring notions. And when you look at it more reasonably, in terms of the system as a whole, you can see that this is a horror story.
It's a parasite that flourishes at the host's expense, right?
Yeah, and it is a glorification of that parasitism.
Yeah, so I mean, like, I think there's one thing maybe worth pointing out, that, like, ultra stability can be desirable, like, if the system isn't pathological. Like, I think
yes, no, it is okay for some systems to reproduce themselves.
Yeah, it's in fact desirable. This is the autopoiesis that we were talking about in previous episodes, right? That a system that produces more of itself can be a really good thing if it's a good system. And that's kind of what Stafford is trying to get us towards here, is that, like, we really need to take apart and just fucking destroy these utterly dysfunctional, ultra-stable systems. And because they put up such a fight, you're going to have to actually kill it. Like, it's kind of not going to be possible to reform it. Like, it's going to be a messy operation to get rid of the thing. But that we should be replacing them with institutions that are also ultra-stable, because, ongoing stability is kind of nice, but don't exhibit these pathologies because we do the good kind of variety engineering on them.
Right, which is to say, like, they're meaningfully recursively connected with the rest of society in ways that serve to foster its self-reproduction and the viability of individuals across the social structure, as opposed to simply within that core administrative apparatus.
Yeah. Well, like, to call back to the third lecture, right, the Liberty Machine, the machine the social machine that produces liberty as its output, and is also ultra stable and holds itself stable so that it can continuously produce liberty as its output. Oh boy, yeah, it's good stuff. Yeah, so going on to the final lecture, The Free Man in a Cybernetic World, which I think is a wonderful title. A lot of this is just kind of covering ground we've already covered, so I don't feel we need to go through it in extreme detail. There's a couple of new ideas, though. Well, one thing is that he touches on is, like, again, touches back to designing freedom, right? Like, design implies science and collective conscious action, right? Like, but the freedom part is joy and humanity and this sort of thing. Like, it's a science for freedom, not against it, right? Like, it's science for humanity, not against it. Yeah, so sorry, Nick Land. Capital technology isn't going to shed its human skin. We're going to have technology for humanity instead of against it, you know?
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, in a way, the Landian fantasy is like the West Wing ramped up to 9,000, right?
Fuck.
It's like not only does it not serve like the majority of people, it also doesn't even serve the people at the top. Doesn't serve anybody at all. It's just ultra stable, and that's all it's got going for it.
God damn. That is wonderful. Yeah. Oh boy. Yeah, fabulous. I think Nick would be fucking furious to be compared in any way to the West Wing.
Yeah.
The cathedral or whatever it is he calls it.
Right.
What an asshole. But anyway, there's another really good point here that, like, you know what, like, science does present a threat to freedom, and that's precisely why we should engage in it and deal with it. Like, I mean, otherwise, if you don't, the threat runs wild. It's like, scissors are sharp. You have to learn to fucking handle them. Like, this is the thing. Like, and if we're going to be, as a society, you know, big grown-ups that get to play with the big scissors, then we're going to have to actually be, like, good and responsible at this. So it's an argument for leaning into science rather than away from it. Which is good because, yeah, if you don't engage in it, it's just going to go nuts and probably kill you anyway. Which it's on the path to doing at the moment.
Yeah, we're certainly doing a good job of that.
Yeah. But we touch on planning then. Like, is this term unpredictive prophecy, right? Where we can't predict the future, right? Like, and in that indeterminacy, we have freedom, right? There's, like, things aren't fully determined, right? And he's making a play here for planning, right? Which has taken up a bad reputation because of really shitty non-adaptive plans, such as, you know, Gosplan or whatever, the stuff we read about in Read Plenty. But that if we can do continuous adaptive planning, that's like navigational, we can create the future rather than predicting it, right? You don't need to predict the future if you're able to steer on the waves of time and create the future you want.
Yeah, and often in economics, this is sometimes talked about in, like, terms of, like, ergodic versus non-ergodic. So in essentially the idea here is that, like, it's a question of, can we know the future in any detail at all? And if we can't, the important thing to do is to basically, make our future, design our future, create our future, act and see what happens, right? But to do so in an intelligent way, rather than reacting to predictions, right? So, yeah, this is, I mean, I feel like there's definitely a whole show to be done just about this subject of, like, how do we think about our relationship to the future when we make plans or organize ourselves or do work? It's a really important question, not addressed in any depth here, but it's certainly suggestive what he's saying.
Yeah. We should pick out some material to cover on that, certainly. Yeah, and I guess the sort of last point as he sort of trails off, is that we need bold experiments, right? Like we kind of need an experimental society, one in which science is essentially distributed and cheap. It's kind of non-costly, both in terms of like material cost and in kind of institutional cost to carry out experiments. And there's a nice little sort of bit here as well about like he has seen the beginnings of this in Chile again, but that, you know, even then in that situation, like even the middle class was on side for this stuff, right? That like there was a sense of people coming together to experiment and to design their society. I like that. In places, Beer remarks that he sort of presumes that people are acting in good faith and that like everyone's got the same sort of, which strikes me as a bit sort of naive. But I think it's also maybe an important corrective for some of the very deterministic sort of cynicism that we get on the left a bit, where it's like anyone that makes more than 10 grand a year is by definition a reactionary or something. That we have to believe in the possibility for people to change and for people to come together to redesign their society. Because if we don't believe that, we're wasting our fucking time. Like, you know, that's like pointless.
Yeah. Totally. Like that is very true. It is important to bear in mind that there is room for different outcomes politically among many strata of society, and in fact, you know, it's perfectly possible for someone who makes 10 grand a year to be a dyed-in-the-wool reactionary, right? Like, does their class interest suggest that they would be? No, but if they're also atomized and disorganized, then it's completely possible that's how things will turn out. So, like, there's no automatic class consciousness, no automatic class project, and to just say, well, there is a small core of the virtuous and the rest of society is corrupt and evil, is not only ignorant of the actual realities of working class life, but is also furthermore ignorant of just the variety of social experience. And yeah, it very much feels like a retreat to a kind of fantasy land.
I think in many cases it's a comforting fantasy for because I see a lot of this on the sort of some leftists, right? That like the belief that like essentially the project is hopeless. That like, oh well, you know, you can't convince the middle classes, they're just reactionaries, all that kind of shit. It's like I think it's a comforting fantasy to believe in some kind of determinism. Because as Stafford remarks here, right, like it's in indeterminacy that we find liberty, right? Like that's the wiggle room that allows for better futures. However, facing up to that indeterminacy is also kind of scary, and I think I've definitely encountered people for whom the comfort of determinism is worth more to them than the possibility of a better future, which fucking blows. Like, get out of here with that shit.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And yeah, like I understand that. Like, you know, I mean, I've certainly had my moments of clinging to determinacy just because even if it is a dismal determinacy, it is nonetheless something to cling on to. And I mean that's, you know, it's a characteristic response to abuse, and we live in an abusive society. So, I mean, it is unfortunate that people fall into those patterns, and it's understandable they do, but that doesn't make it good politics.
No. And you know what, we can do better, right? Like, this is one of the messages that Stafford is transmitting to us here loud and clear, is that this is possible, it can be done. And he signs off with the remark that men have always navigated those unfathomable waters, and we can do it now. Yes, this is doable. It's hard, but it's doable, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, this guy had just got back from his big, huge multi-year project being crushed by a fascist coup. Yeah, his friends were shot or exiled or imprisoned, and everything he worked on had just fallen apart. And if he can muster that kind of optimism in the face of that kind of shit, well, I guess it's kind of incumbent on us to find something similar.
Yeah. I thoroughly enjoyed this read. Real good.
Yeah. As we've said, it kind of suffers a bit from coming from some lectures on radio in the weird format that they had, but a lot of interesting ideas here. Beer always has some good turns of phrase.
Oh, no, hold on. Before we wrap up, I have to find that bit. Oh, gosh.
Is this the angel thing?
No, the one about things that'll destroy society.
Oh, yes.
Ooh,
yes.
Boy. Where the hell is it? There it is, right? So, he has these wonderful turns of phrase, and he's a flair for drama, and but there's this wonderful bit where he just says, every time we hear that a proposal will destroy society as we know it, we should have the courage to say, "Thank God, at last."
Yeah.
Fuck. Wow.
Yeah, it's it's really fascinating, right? Because absolutely, what he's making a revolutionary statement there. And because, what he's saying is that the institutions we have, they may do us some good, but generally they're shit.
They should be destroyed. Right? We should be fucking glad
they should be destroyed.
Yes.
Yeah, and that has been a fundamental insight of the communist project for a good long time now. And it's also quite interesting because it's very, in a way, very similar to Thatcher's attack on society, right? In later years, this is 73. This is not yet Thatcherism, and you can see how a lot of the support that Thatcherism got came from a reasonable place, right? That there was this real frustration with institutions. There was this real sense that bureaucracy was out of control. Did Thatcherism do anything at all to help with those problems? No, of course not. It not only did it not destroy society in any constructive way, in fact, it reinforced the worst parts of society. But there was a similar problematic that Beer was working in and that the Thatcherites were working in. And it's a shame that we got that answer to the problem rather than Beer's answer to the problem. But, the point nevertheless stands. When, people are talking left, right, and center all the time right now about populism, the hoi polloi are getting, restful. The yellow jackets are out in the streets burning the Champs-Elysees, right? And I think, I've seen, I'm sure this episode is going to be dated when it is released.
Fucking March or something, yeah.
Yeah, but it is, I've seen a lot of people just sort of instinctively look at those protests and look at the populist movement and say, oh, well, of course they cannot be trusted. They must all secretly be fascists. It's no, what you're scared of is the indeterminacy of these movements. You're scared of the fact that they are expressing legitimate problems in the society in a way that isn't decided how it's going to turn out, right? You can end up with something as a result of these sort of protests, like the election of Bolsonaro, right? It came out of a very similar sort of protest movement that escalated until you ended up with a fascist in power, right? And that was not purely a result of the popular movement, but the fascists were successful in infiltrating and operationalizing that movement. And a similar thing could happen in France, right? It could, but it doesn't mean it's decided, right? And it's a similar situation to Beer saying, every time we hear a proposal will destroy society as we know it, we should have the courage to say, thank God at last. And Thatcher saying there is no society, right? Like, that was an indeterminate moment, and it went the wrong way, in the similar way to the way that things have gone in Brazil. But it doesn't mean that the matter is decided, and every time something indeterminate happens, you just shut yourself off and say, oh, they all must be fascists. Because, like, what kind of revolutionary are you?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Well, like, if you're not leaning in, right? Like, if you're not engaging, they are all going to turn out to be fascists. Like, it's going to, like, there's this hopelessness and this cynicism. It just isn't fucking productive, right? Like, you can't. When the rupture you wanted arrives, lean the fuck in. Come on,
Yeah, because I mean, I have news for some people, but revolutions are indeterminate. They are moments of chaos, right? Like, these happen in moments of chaos. They do not happen in a predetermined way. It's only they seem that way when you read a historical synopsis. But yeah, like, we've got to deal with indeterminacy, and this kind of cybernetic understanding can help us in that.
Yeah. And I mean, courage is the operative word in that sort of statement that Beer made, right? Like, yeah, gotta have the courage to say, "Thank God at last."
Yeah,
and this mode of organizational cybernetics, I think, is extremely promising, and I mean, I think it's the way forward. Like, it's it's good stuff. Is there anything else we should cover before we wrap up?
I don't think so.
Cool, we got it. Thanks, listeners, for coming along on this one. It's all, as always, it is appreciated. If you'd like to keep up with us, you can follow us on Twitter @GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook as General Intellect Unit. We're on the web at generalintellectunit.net. All the podcasting apps, subscribe, all that kind of crap. But the two best ways to help us out are to share us around with people you think might be interested in listening to this kind of thing. And second best way is to go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit and throw us a couple of bucks a month to pay for books and hosting and that sort of thing. But thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you again in a couple of weeks with another episode. Bye.